Hello, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where in the world you are. My name is Alexandra Barrantes. I'm the Senior Social Policy Specialist at Development Pathways. And it is today our pleasure to be hosting this webinar on why is social protection vital to ensure that no person with a disability is left behind. The webinar has a duration of around an hour and a half, and we will first provide some space for the presenters, which I'm going to introduce right now, to give a presentation. And then afterwards, we will have around half an hour for questions and answers. And if you want to raise any questions, please look at the chat window that you have on your screen, and you'll be able to key in your questions there, and we'll try and answer as many questions as time permits for today. So today we've got two presenters who are going to be talking about some of the discussion around research that they've done on social protection and disability, and we'll get two different points of view in terms of the overall, the more general research scope that was as a continuous research, and also some specific case studies. We've got on the first place, we've got Stephen Kidd, who is the Senior Social Policy Specialist at Development Pathways. And afterwards, we will have Morgan Banks from the research. She's a research fellow from the International Centre for Evidence and Disability at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So without further ado, let me introduce Stephen so he can start with his presentation. And please remember that we will have an answer and question sessions after the two presenters begin. So thank you, and Stephen, go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex. Hi, sorry for the delay. I forgot to unmute my microphone. So today I'm going to be talking about research that we undertook, which was funded by DFID, to see how disability could be made more, or social protection could be more inclusive of persons with disabilities. So we can move to the next slide. The research, the key question in the research was what works to effectively meet the needs of people with disabilities through social protection programs and systems in low and middle income countries. And there were three main components to the research. One was a literature review where we looked at over 130 pieces of literature from around the world. We put together a comprehensive literature review and annotated bibliography. We then took short country research of between a week and 2 weeks in 7 countries: Brazil, India, Kenya, Mauritius, Rwanda, South Africa, and Zambia, and did comprehensive reports on each country. And we also undertook quantitative analysis of data sets that we managed to find that had both questions on social protection and disability. And unfortunately, there's not many data sets like that around the world. So we looked mainly at Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, Malawi, Rwanda, and South Africa. And so the research brings together all of that into an overall research report, which we hope to release very soon. So we go to the next slide. I think one thing that we found, and that we really need to stress at the beginning, is the importance of the importance of recognizing that disability is a very, very significant issue, and it's often ignored across many, many areas of life. We often we talk about poverty, but we forget about disability and the impacts that of the way that disability can actually lead to increasing levels of poverty and create challenges for both individuals and households. So around 15% of the world's population is estimated by WHO and the World Bank to have a disability. And as you can see in these graphs, where we looked at 3 countries in terms of the proportion of on the left-hand graph is looking at the proportion of people in each age group that have a disability, and the right-hand graph looks at the absolute, the proportion across all persons with disabilities, how many of them are in each age group. And as you can see on the left-hand one, that disability increases in prevalence by age. Overall, worldwide, about 46% of older persons have a disability, and around 5.1% of children. But in each country, depending on the distribution of the population, sometime in some countries we find the absolute numbers, we find many more persons with disability amongst children, those of working age. In those with older populations, such as Vietnam, we find that it's still amongst the older population, we have more persons with disability in the population. But the one important thing to remember and recognize is that in many countries, or probably in most countries, and the countries we were looked at, over 25% of households have a disabled member, which is almost a quarter of households. It's a very, very significant issue that needs to be addressed, and social protection has a key role in this. So we go to the next slide. Now, if we look at issues around the, people say, well, what are the sort of measures of poverty? Are households with persons with disability poorer or less poor than in other households? So here we've looked at 4 countries and looked at the relative levels of poverty between those with severe functional limitations or disabilities and those without. And you can see in some of the countries, in South Africa and Ethiopia, we do find that higher levels of poverty amongst persons with households with disability, but it's not a consistent picture around the world. But the important thing to remember and recognize is that households, including persons with disabilities, face significant additional expenses. These expenses might be health costs, might be transport costs. And these additional costs can range from 10% extra to more than 50% extra in households. So you find that households that may have similar incomes or expenditure, actually the standards of living, if you're a household with a person with a disability, is significantly lower. And one of the real drivers behind disability benefits is to actually compensate for these additional costs that persons with disability have, much of which inhibits these households or these individuals and households to engage in social life and also to engage in employment. So we go to the next slide. And I think it's also important to recognize that the disability and the risks and challenges that people face with disabilities vary across the life cycle. And part of our research, what came up is in many countries how disability, if a couple if a family has a child with a disability, it's often seen as a curse. Very frequently, husbands might abandon the wife. The wife is then left with responsibilities for care, has to leave work, and has very high, very significant costs of supporting the child, which can throw that household or that small family into extreme poverty very, very quickly. But throughout the life cycle, we find many challenges. The challenges that children with disabilities having going to school, if it can face extra costs, in addition to the sort of discrimination that they face. And through working age, people becoming disabled in working age can have a very, very significant impact. If you're a breadwinner of a household and you experience a disability, that can significantly impact. You lose your job, perhaps your partner has to start taking care of you, and that can really impact on the household very, very significantly, particularly if there is no support from the social protection system. And of course, in old age, people become frailer, they become increasingly disabled. It's often not recognized as a disability in old age, but it is, and is often not addressed. And this can lead to issues of social exclusion because people are unable to gain their own income. And we have to recognize these different risks across the life cycle, and the social protection system should begin to address these risks. So if we go to the next slide. So I think when we're looking at social protection, I think before we move on, it's often people try to classify different types of social protection program in different ways. The usual classification is to describe some schemes as disability specific. These are the kind of classic disability benefits of different types for children and for adults. Another classification is mainstream schemes, which people with disabilities are expected to be able to access with the similar rights to anybody else. And many writers bring in a third type of, or some writers bring in a third type of scheme called targeted mainstream schemes, where these are sort of mainstream benefits which have a sort of bias to bring in persons with disability. But generally around the world, they're very small schemes, often donor funded. We find in some countries in Africa, but we don't find really governments themselves put in place those schemes at large scale. What we did in the research was add in a different classification to that, which is disability relevant schemes. And this is sort of recognizing that some schemes, particularly old age pensions, really begin to reach, for many age groups, the majority of recipients have a disability, and they're critically important for addressing disability. And one part of the research is to highlight the importance of old age pensions as a form of disability benefit, given the nature of the recipients and the fact that many people who are of eligible age are likely to experience a disability, and having an old age pension in place is very important for giving them the income security that they require. So the next slide. So what we found in the overall in the research, and this slide begins to try to summarize it, is that if we're talking about how to include persons with disability in the social protection system, there is a big difference between countries that just have mainstream schemes and countries that have disability specific and relevant schemes and mainstream schemes at the same time. So South Africa is a good example of a country that has a range of disability specific schemes. It has a disability benefit for young children and for working age adults, an old age pension, and a child benefit scheme that is a mainstream scheme. And we see there that we have much higher inclusion and very high inclusion of households that have a person with a disability in being able to access social protection. 80% of households are able to that include a person with a disability are able to access social protection, much more than the households which don't have a disability. But as schemes begin very low coverage, but persons with disability then have very low coverage as well. And we also found in one country, Indonesia, that actually persons with disability had less access to the social protection system than people without a disability, which shows a clear discrimination against persons with disability, in part because schemes there tend to be focused on children who are accessing school. Therefore, persons with disability are necessarily more limited in their access. So we move to the next slide. So what we, I think one part of the research was to try and then sort of classify what would be the kind of system that if countries wanted to really address disability and put in place inclusion of and really increase the inclusion of persons with disability, that they need to put in place a disability sensitive social protection system across the life cycle, which would include, under sort of tax finance schemes for children, put in place child disability benefits, which are critically important for children with disabilities, particularly for those where we find that the households or families have been plunged into poverty. And then across the working age, it's also very important to put in place disability benefits of different types. But there we try to distinguish between two types of disability scheme, which you don't find in low and middle income countries, but you find in high income countries. Or one are income replacement schemes, which are put in place for persons with disability who are unable to work, and whether it's for the reason just because of their disability or because of the interaction between their disability and their ability to get a job in the labor market. So this is for those who can't work. But then something more, a scheme which we call here a personal independence payment, which is a scheme that compensates you for the additional costs that you that you have from having a disability, but is not linked to not being able to work, but is actually put in place to enable people to access work much more and compensate for the additional costs they have. That this type of scheme should ideally continue into old age, where it would be linked with having universal old age pension coverage to ensure that every person with disability has an income replacement at that area. And the type of scheme that is really rarely talked about is the need to put in place sort of care or support benefits for those people, particularly family members, who've had to give up work to care for and support persons with disability. And this is very, very rare that we find this in low and middle income countries. There's a very small example of very low benefits in South Africa, but it is critically important, because when people are having to give up a job to provide the support, that can have a major impact on a family's well-being. So we go to the next slide. Now, as we were saying, the sort of mainstream schemes, when they're targeted at persons with when they're targeted at the poor, tend to have much lower coverage generally of people, but particularly of persons with disability. So here's looking at, in this slide, at 4 countries: South Africa, India, Ethiopia, and Indonesia. And we're looking across the quintiles of the population, from the poorest quintile to the richest quintile, and seeing where we find the highest coverage. And we find that in South Africa, which has much more investment in a mixed system, and most of its schemes are, rather than being targeted at the very poor, are affluence tested, where they're trying to take out the wealthy. We find that they're very effective in including, South Africa is very effective in including those who are living much more in poverty, that experience a disability. Whereas in some of the countries, in the country of Ethiopia and Indonesia, where it's much more targeted at the very, very poor, we find even in Indonesia, certain biases that actually the very poorest persons with disability are much more likely to be excluded. And therefore, it's a key issue in terms of the type of targeting. What we couldn't do, because of the data sets available, is look at countries which had much more inclusive schemes, much more universal benefits for persons with disability. Countries like Georgia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, for example, which should have been good examples, but we don't have the data to be able to really see how this would really impact on inclusion in the social protection system. But the strong likelihood is that this would lead to much higher inclusion. So if we move to the next slide, and we can see an example of this when we just look at old age pensions and the impacts and the coverage of persons with disability. These are slides that we put together to try and look at coverage across the wealth distribution within countries. So in each of these countries, Georgia, Bolivia, South Africa, and India, we're looking at different types of old age pension system. Now, Georgia and Bolivia both have universal pensions. South Africa has an affluence tested pension, which goes to about 70% of older persons. And India has a very targeted pension. Now, the green shows, the blue shows those across the consumption decile, from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right, those that are included in the program, and the green is those that are excluded. And we can see in the universal programs in Georgia and Bolivia that we have, as you might expect, very high inclusion of all older persons. Unfortunately, those data sets, we don't know who has a disability or not, but in a country like Georgia, only 2% of older persons are excluded from the program, which would be the exclusion area. And we have very, very high inclusion of those living in extreme poverty. In South Africa, with this affluence test, where you just have to declare your income and sign an affidavit to be accepted, we find very good inclusion of persons with disability within the old age pension system. But at the point of the red line, which is the sort of point of the means test, there we find begins to be a big drop of people that are excluded. So the targeting system works relatively well with the old age pension system in South Africa in terms of inclusion of the of persons with disability living in poverty. But in India, which is targeted at the very poor, we find pretty much a random distribution of persons with disability and very, very high exclusion of those persons with disability, older people living in poverty. So it clearly shows, certainly in old age pensions, that if we want to include persons with disability, we have to move to universal coverage of pensions. Next slide. And an interesting issue, this is shown in South Africa, different types of functional limitation that people have that were assessed in a data set in South Africa. And I don't have time because of the time we have to describe in detail it, but what it does show along the left-hand side on the yellow bars are those who are recognized as being unable to do something, and we find actually, which is interesting, that they have less inclusion in the old age pension in South Africa, and we'll discuss some of the reasons about for that later, and that there's higher inclusion amongst those who have a less severe impairment within South Africa. So it does show that perhaps we need the importance of addressing, looking at disability across the board and really addressing the needs of those who have facing the most significant challenges. So we move on to the next slide. So this is a slide looking at disability benefits and the inclusion of persons with accessing disability benefits of working age. And we're looking at here at South Africa and India. And we find an interesting picture in that compared to old age pensions, even though the disability benefit in South Africa is meant to have very high inclusion, the means test is set at a very high rate, we find the coverage there, looking across the consumption deciles, is relatively consistent. And many people living with a disability, living in extreme poverty in South Africa, are excluded from the disability benefit system. However, it has much higher coverage than in India. We have a program that's very, very much targeted at those living in poverty, and really is very random, with very, very low inclusion of those living in poverty with a disability. So the good news about South Africa is you have higher coverage. It's put in place, trying to cover more, but still, persons with disabilities are facing significant barriers, those of working age, to actually access the system. Next slide. When we look across the world, though, at the different types of working age disability benefits and the examples that we find across the world, we don't find too many examples, but it is interesting to compare the coverage that we do find in some countries, particularly Uzbekistan, Georgia, South Africa, and Mauritius. Quite high coverage of about 3% of the working age population are reached by disability benefits. And these countries essentially have universal or near universal coverage, so a high proportion of people are reaching accessing the benefits. But there are many countries where the proportion is much less. It's more difficult for persons with disability to get in, and some countries the proportion is very low, but at least these countries have disability benefits in place. One interesting case is Nepal, in that it has a universal disability benefit but very, very low access, and Morgan will be talking more about the challenges that persons with disability have in accessing disability benefits in Nepal. So next slide. And again, if we look at South Africa, it is also interesting to see that actually there's very significant differences between the type of functional limitation that people experience and access to the disability benefit, which should be looked at much more in further research. So people with seeing and hearing limitations are much less likely to access the disability benefits in South Africa. Those that tend to have more perhaps learning difficulties, indicated by self-care and communication, tend to have higher coverage. But again, some of them, particularly those with self-care and communication challenges, for those with the most severe challenges, are facing less inclusion than those with less severe benefits. So we can move on to the next slide. One key issue around disability benefits for the working age is the extent to which they encourage or discourage people in accessing employment. And one of the big design issues, and we find in many countries, is that often working age benefits are given to on the basis that you're not in employment, that you don't work, kind of on an assumption that persons with disability are unable to work. That's kind of the underlying issue. And we find so in South Africa, which only gives the disability benefits to those who are able to, supposedly unable to work, we find that only 10% of those receiving the disability grant are in work, compared to 44% without the benefit. Now, there's all kinds of issues of access, as we pointed out earlier, to the schemes, but it is a major problem that many countries are disincentivizing persons with disability working age from taking a job by forcing them to exit the labor market if they're going to access the disability benefit. So it's only 6% of those in South Africa who access the working age disability benefit are willing to take a job. And what we highlight in the research is the importance really of these schemes of either removing the work capacity assessment, as happens in Mauritius, where people can get the disability benefit and work, but also, as we talked earlier, of looking at two different types of benefit. One, the income replacement benefit for those who really cannot work, but also the personal independence benefit to enable those who are able to work to access a benefit that compensates them for the additional costs that they face in terms of health or travel, etc. So move on to the next slide. On mainstream schemes, I think because of time, I won't talk too much about this. I think we have to differentiate very much between different types of mainstream schemes. Many of the schemes that we find, which I call sort of poor relief schemes for the poor, such as conditional cash transfers, workfare schemes, or some of these targeted mainstream schemes, which are meant to be for the very, very poorest without labor capacity, are very different to a more an inclusive life cycle mainstream scheme like a child benefit, such as Mongolia's universal child benefit, where we know that 99% of children are accessing, so most children with disabilities are able to access that scheme. Amongst the schemes targeted at the poor, as I was saying earlier, we find much less access, and many of the targeting mechanisms that are used are actually unable to give to identify persons with disability who are facing these additional costs that they have and include them in schemes. So move to the next scheme, the next slide. So the a targeting mechanism called proxy means tests is being used many countries around the world. We've done a lot of research on this elsewhere, and we find this is a very, very arbitrary mechanism. I don't have much time to go through this, but this is trying to locate, in the case of Malawi, on a proxy means test, each dot is a household, and we're trying to rank households here from poorest to richest. On the x-axis at the bottom, the ranking is by the expenditure predicted by the proxy means test. So what the targeting mechanism predicts how well off people are or how poor they are. And on the left hand side, the y-axis, it's showing the actual expenditure of people from the household survey. And we can see that if it was perfectly targeted, the scheme, you would find from the bottom left-hand corner to the top right-hand corner, we would find everybody located on one line from the bottom left to the top right. But here we find, in fact, a scatter, which kind of shows the relative arbitrariness of the scheme. Now, on this, those in red, the dots in red, are households without a person with a disability, and those in blue are households with a person with a severe disability. And you can see they're also very much part of the scatter. Now, we've put two lines in there in black, and the vertical line is showing those to the left are those that would be targeted by the proxy means test. And you can see that many people would be are inclusion areas. They're better off than the 20%, and many of those are persons with disability. But more worryingly, if you look at the horizontal line, that's showing the actual persons who really are in the poorest 20%, and we find that many very poor households with persons with disability, not even taking into account the additional cost of being excluded, are being identified as quite well off and are being excluded by proxy means tests. And this, I think, in terms of very much qualitative research, is very much the experience of people who feel as though they're being excluded. So we move to the next slide, and this slide on the left just shows the kind of errors that we would expect then from a proxy means test in general. And this is looking again at the Malawi example. When you're targeting down at, say, 10% poorest to 20% poorest, we're looking at exclusion errors of 10 to 20%. But even in the Malawi example, we're finding that actually it's discriminating a target of 20% against persons with disability who are more likely to be excluded. what we've done in the paper, I don't have time to go in here, is to try to modify a proxy means test by taking into account disability and the disability costs, additional costs that people have. You can adjust proxy means tests, and as we put the paper out, we'll be able to show that. That can then make certain that a proxy means test gives much higher inclusion to persons with disability. So with some adjustments and being disability sensitive, we can adjust some of these targeting mechanisms to make certain that persons with disability are more likely to be excluded who are living in poverty. So move to the next slide. There's other types of targeting mechanism that are used. We did some analysis around this. We looked at community-based targeting, some schemes on community-based targeting. We looked at Ethiopia's productive safety net program and the access of persons with disability. All those to the left of the red line should have been able to access the program in persons with severe disability in Ethiopia. And we find there was very low inclusion of persons with severe disabilities in the Ethiopia's productive safety net program, and very high leakage of the program to those who were better off. So it wasn't actually doing a very good job, the community-based targeting there, of incorporating persons with disability. And in Rwanda's direct support scheme, which is meant to be biased towards persons with disability, again, those to the left of the red line are those that are meant to be in the scheme. We find very high levels of exclusion of persons with disability. So targeting programs at the very poor tend to whatever mechanism to lead to high levels of exclusion of persons with disability. So we move to the next slide. And this is just showing a public works scheme to see what we found in terms of access of persons with disability to a public works scheme. This is India's employment guarantee scheme, looking across different types of disability there. The blue is those without a disability, and seeing what proportion of the population in India accesses the scheme there in rural areas, and it's around 9% are accessing the scheme. But then when you look at disability, we find much less inclusion of persons with disability into the employment guarantee scheme there, and particularly those with the most severe limitations. So a works program really is not going to serve the interests of many persons with disability, and needs to be put much part of a much more inclusive system with disability specific and disability relevant schemes like old age pensions and disability benefits. In the paper, when it comes out, you'll see many examples of how some public works schemes have tried to include more persons with disability, for example, in India, but you can see still with often with not the greatest success. Next slide. So just coming near the end, I think, I was looking up to now sort of a high level in the types of policy that needs to be put in place for persons with inclusion in schemes of persons with disability, and arguing that we need much more inclusive systems, life cycle systems, which actually do, and it's critically important, have schemes specifically for persons with disability and old age pensions, that will lead to much higher inclusion. But irrespective, and looking back at some of the other schemes, we've seen that the challenges, particularly those with most severe disabilities, have in accessing schemes, and many of this comes down to the implementation challenges. And this talk, I don't really have much time to get into that, but in the paper we have a lot of examples about that and ideas and good practice about how to improve things. But many of the challenges that people with disability face are issues around communications. Often the communications about the existence of a scheme and how to access it are not disability sensitive. So perhaps people with hearing difficulties are not going to be able to hear the radio. Many things are published without thinking about the challenges that people have. Visual impairments may benefit from much larger print, etc., or braille. And so this is often not addressed in communication, so persons with disability are unable to access both disability-specific and mainstream schemes. Often for disability benefits, there's a very onerous registration process, where often may take many visits in a country like South Africa, where you can only get the scheme once you've undertaken a disability assessment that is done by the South African Social Security Association. You may have to go various times, make various visits to different government offices to get different documents, and to the SASSA offices to get to register, which can be very difficult for persons with disability and very costly. And you may end up having to, as in many cases, having to appeal, and much more needs to be done to streamline and give support to persons who are actually trying to register. Brazil, for example, compensates people for the additional costs that they have in terms of trying to access disability benefits. Often people with disabilities face challenges of distances to the registration point, the much higher transport costs. This is one of the reasons, I think, for the low, as we'll see, the low access in Nepal, is that the very long distances that people have to travel without any support to be able to apply for a disability benefit. But often people with disabilities may have additional costs. You may, if you have a wheelchair, need to occupy 2 seats and pay 2 tickets. You may have to have a taxi to get there. And there are other challenges that people face in terms of access to the registration centers. For example, there may not be good disability access in terms of ramps, or even just if you have lifts in areas, there may not be braille that's in place for persons with visual disabilities to be able to know how to use the lifts. And often people are facing staff that are discriminatory or just really don't know how to deal with persons with disability, particularly those that have more cognitive or mental illnesses, and they may find it challenging, and this could lead to lots of discrimination. So we have a lot of examples in the report of these challenges and suggestions by identifying countries that are trying to address this in terms of overcoming these different barriers. So we go to the next slide. So it's come to the second last slide here, and it's actually just trying to show what a difference it can make, though, in terms of the well-being of persons with disability if countries invest sufficiently in a disability sensitive system. Now, South Africa has a lot of challenges, but it is a good example of a country that has quite an inclusive system. It's spending 3.5% of GDP in terms of putting in place a social protection system. And what this graph shows is the impacts on food poverty of different types of benefits on persons with disabilities in South Africa. Now, we have the ages across the bottom from youngest to oldest, and the poverty rates for each age group without any schemes in place would be the very top line, where you can see that would be the poverty rates in South Africa, the food poverty rates, if they didn't have a social protection system in place. And we can see the blue line, or the blue group at the bottom, the top of the blue line, are the actual poverty rates, food poverty rates in South Africa. And we can see for persons with severe disabilities, and we can see a very, very significant impact there from mainstream schemes like the child support grant, but particularly from the disability benefits that they have in South Africa and from the old age pension. And this kind of shows what countries can begin to achieve and transform the lives of persons with disabilities. But of course, the design needs to be thought of much more to enable people to access schemes and overcome barriers, but also gain employment, and not, as happens in South Africa, discourage people from working. And so just move to the next slide. And the next slide is just showing, in fact, the sort of challenges. What we find, it's great. We know what works. We know that putting in place old age pensions and disability specific benefits works. But in fact, the levels of investment, are relatively low in some countries. So on the left, we see the levels of investment in disability benefits as a percentage of GDP. Only a few countries are really investing more than 0.5% of GDP. Uzbekistan's an outlier with 2% of GDP. Namibia has about 1% of GDP. But in most countries, in low and middle income countries, the investment is very little. There's around 50 countries that have disability-specific benefits. These are showing the highest countries with the highest levels of investment. In most, it's tiny. So we're actually not giving any support to persons of working age or children with disabilities in most low and middle income countries. The situation with old age pensions is better. Old age pensions are perhaps the most popular scheme now in low and middle income countries, certainly with high income countries included. We have a range of countries that are putting in place much higher levels of investment in more universal benefits, that's those in blue, but many countries still are significantly underinvested in old age pensions, so many persons old age and disability are missing out. So we go to the last slide. So in conclusions, I think, one conclusion from the research, which is pretty obvious in a sense, is that if we wanted our social protection system to be disability inclusive, countries have to be willing to invest sufficiently to help people access the scheme and access and build inclusive life cycle social protection systems with disability-specific old age pensions. Just targeting schemes at the very poor with very low levels of investment, as we do with conditional cash transfer schemes, etc., where levels of investment might only be 0.2, 0.3, 0.4% of GDP, don't include the majority of persons with living in poverty, and they certainly don't include the majority of persons with disability. In fact, the vast majority are excluded. And as I was trying to show, we also need to really think about the design of schemes to make certain they're disability sensitive and think about the challenges that persons with disability have in accessing schemes through the registration. So that's all. I've gone a little bit longer. Alex is sitting actually in the same room as me, looking at me and frowning, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, very much for that and for sharing some of the key challenges and issues around inclusion of persons with disabilities in social protection schemes, and also for sharing some of the main considerations in terms of being able to design and invest in more inclusive life cycle social protection scheme versus more mainstream poor relief schemes that have been implemented in various countries, for sharing some of the case studies and also shedding some more light on the exclusion errors tools like PMTs can cause. We're now going to go straight to Morgan Banks. As I said before, she's a research fellow at the International Centre for Evidence in Disability at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So without further ado, please, Morgan, if you can connect, and I'll disconnect.
Thank you very much, Alexandra and Stephen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done at the International Centre for Evidence in Disability that was funded by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and was conducted in conjunction with the Hanoi University of Public Health in Vietnam and the Valley Research Group in Nepal. So if you go to the next slide, I'll start by talking a little bit about some of the aims of the project. So this study was aimed to look at the extent to which people with disabilities are included in social protection programs in 2 selected countries and to assess whether these programs met their needs. So we were looking at countries that were thought to demonstrate good practices in disability inclusive social protection. And so with that in mind, after a rapid policy review in a range of countries in Asia and the Pacific, we settled on Nepal and Vietnam as the research settings for this country. Now, if you go to the next slide, we'll see the settings for this research. So while in both countries we took a national policy overview, so we did an in-depth analysis of the policies in both countries, we also did in-depth research in 2 districts in the study countries. So in Nepal, that was the district of Tanahun, which is in the hills region of Nepal. And in Vietnam, we were in Cam Le, which is part of the province of Da Nang in central Vietnam. And these 2 settings were selected as they were thought to provide the best opportunity to identify examples of good practices. The social protection system was believed to be relatively well functioning, and they had a good range of disability supports and involvements of DPOs in those areas. Okay, if you go to the next slide. So for both countries, before I get started, I'll just give an overview of what some of the social protection entitlements were in both countries. So in both settings, there was a range of disability targeted entitlements as well as more mainstream non-targeted programs. So in the next slide, I'll start by giving an overview of some of Nepal's programs. So starting with the disability targeted programs. So in this setting, eligibility was based only on the presence of disability. So Stephen talked about some programs that were needs tested, and this was not a criteria for eligibility in Nepal. And in addition to assessing eligibility based on disability, there was a component of analyzing the severity of disability. And this assessment of severity depended what types of benefits a person was eligible to receive. So if we look at the next slide, in Nepal, there was a range of different types of benefits that people with disabilities could receive. So for the people that were assessed to have the highest degree classifications, and this was the red and blue card holders, they could receive the cash transfer, which was unconditional and worked out to be about $6 to $10 US a month. Additionally, for people with disabilities of any degree level, they could receive a range of benefits such as educational supports covering boarding and some tuition fees for children with disabilities in grades 1 to 8, as well as there was transportation discounts and certain livelihood supports such as pre-vocational training and access to a 5% quota in the job market for the public sector. And there was also healthcare discounts that were available for a limited range of services and certain drugs. Moving to the next slide. So in Nepal, there was also a range of non-targeted schemes that people with disabilities could access if they met other eligibility criteria. So there were other forms of social assistance, for example, programs targeted to adults over 70 and certain minority groups. And there was also a fairly limited social insurance program, and this was only for employees in the formal sector, and even then it was mostly for public sector workers. And as well, for all citizens in Nepal, there is coverage of some basic health care, so mostly for primary level health care and access to some medications. Now, if we move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about Vietnam and the entitlements that are available there. Similar with Nepal, there was a range of disability targeted programs, and these were non-means tested based only on the presence of disability. And again, this severity of disability determined what entitlements people with disabilities were eligible to receive. So on the next slide, we'll go through some of the entitlements similar to in Nepal. So again, we see here that the cash transfer is available to only the people with the highest severity of disability. And here it's about $18 to $24. And in addition, for again, the two highest severity levels, there is state subsidized health insurance. So with this insurance, the state covers the premium as well as 95% of eligible medical expenses. And also similar to Nepal, there are discounts on transportation and certainly livelihood and educational supports. On the next slide, we will see that people with disabilities can also access mainstream schemes as well. On the next slide. And again, this involves various forms of social assistance. Again, there's a program for older adults. And there's a slightly more expansive social insurance system in Vietnam that covers both the formal sector as well as an opt-in program for the informal sector. Health insurance is also widely available in Vietnam. This may be subsidized by the state for certain groups or by employers. And there is also an optional health insurance scheme that anyone can opt into. Okay, so now if we move to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about whether people with disabilities were actually accessing these different schemes. So on the next slide, I'll start with Nepal. So nationally, slightly under 200,000 people with disabilities received the disability card, so they're receiving any type of disability targeted benefit. And of those, about 62,000 received the disability allowance. And if we look at the prevalence using the 2011 census numbers, which have been criticized as being an underestimate, about 37% of people with disabilities receive the disability card and 12% receive the allowance. And there are no national figures looking at the uptake of some of those other benefits I mentioned, or on inclusion in the non-targeted schemes. Next slide. And then when we look at our specific research that we conducted in Tanahun in Nepal, we found that for the disability targeted benefits, about 32% of people with disabilities were accessing the disability card, and only about 15% were receiving the disability allowance. And there was very low uptake of the other benefits, so only a handful of people were accessing transportation discounts or scholarships. Looking at the non-targeted benefits, we saw quite a high participation in other social assistance schemes besides the disability allowance. So if you go to the next slide, we could see the breakdown of some of these schemes. So here we see about 41% of people with disabilities were recipients of any type of social assistance. And interestingly, the disability allowance was not the main scheme that they were accessing. So slightly over a third were accessing the disability allowance, but almost half were accessing the old age allowance, which is given to older adults above 70 years old. And I'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about some of the reasons why we might be seeing that substitution to different forms of social assistance, because it's important to note that people with disabilities were only eligible to receive one type of social assistance. On the next slide, I'll now talk a little bit about the situation in Vietnam. So we see in Vietnam that about 700,000 people with disabilities are covered by the disability allowance as well as the state subsidized health insurance. And this gives a national coverage of about 42 people who are considered to have severe disabilities. And as with Nepal, there's no tracking on the uptake of some of the other disability targeted benefits or the inclusion of people with disabilities in non-targeted schemes. So on the next slide, looking at the research that we did in Cam Lai, so similar to the national average, we found about 41% of people with disabilities were receiving the disability allowance or health insurance due to disability. And there was low uptake of these other targeted benefits. When we moved to the non-targeted benefits, we did see some participation in other social assistance programs, but really we saw the most coverage of health insurance. So almost all people with disabilities had health insurance, so about 40% because of disability, and then another 30% for other reasons. The state targeted them for subsidized health insurance. And then about 20%, a bit over 20%, had bought health insurance through the voluntary scheme. So on the next slide, if we look at social assistance breakdown, so overall about 45% of people with disabilities were recipients of some form of social assistance. And in contrast to Vietnam, we do see that the disability allowance is the predominant form that people access. So about 70% of social assistance recipients were receiving the disability allowance. And the veterans allowance received the next highest amount for veterans or victims of Agent Orange. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, there was no difference in coverage by gender in either setting. We did see decreasing coverage with age, and this is focusing primarily on the disability allowance. And we did see the highest coverage for people with multiple disabilities, and it was lowest for people with sensory disabilities, hearing or visual impairments. Okay, on the next slide. Okay. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the factors that we found which affected access, primarily to the disability targeted schemes, but some of these are applicable to the non-targeted schemes as well. So on the next slide, we're going to start with looking at geographic accessibility as the first factor that influenced uptake of different benefits. So in the countries, we saw a bit of a contrast. In Vietnam, due to recent policy changes, applications have been moved from the provincial capital to the commune, which is the second smallest administrative unit. So it's much closer to people's homes, and people reported that overall the application process was not terribly onerous. In Nepal, in contrast, many people reported that the application process, it was very difficult to get to application points because they were conducted in the district capitals, which were far away from people's home. And Nepal also has a lot of difficult terrain that's difficult to access, particularly without available or accessible transportation. On the next slide, financial accessibility was also a challenge. So the direct costs were typically quite low. The application fees for the programs were very low, but the much higher costs were more indirect costs or opportunity costs. So the travel of getting to the different locations, as well as time forgone on productive activities. So in this quote here, this applicant in Nepal was talking about how she had to leave farming during planting season, and that this could have serious financial impacts for this woman. If you move to the next slide. The third challenge concerned some of the general application procedures. So some of the facilities were not accessible, and while there were certain adaptations to physical accessibility challenges, a major challenge was in presenting information in an accessible format. So alternative forms of communication were rarely provided. The ease of the application process was also a concern, as gathering the necessary documents could involve multiple appointments with different facilities. And particularly in Nepal, there was also noted that there was sort of a lack of transparency around what was needed. So people frequently thought that they'd had all the documentation that they needed, but were told sort of time and again that they were missing certain components. Then on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the disability assessment criteria. So in both countries, the assessment criteria are primarily functioning based, which is helps in creating a more equitable process, which is also more in line with the UNCRPD. But in Vietnam, we did see sort of a heavy focus of their criteria on physical functioning. So they use a scoring system based on an individual's ability to do 8 daily life activities with or without help. And they receive a final score, which determines whether they are mild, severe, or extremely severe. And the issue with this is that most of these focused on physical functioning and self-care. So many people, particularly with mental health impairments or with sensory impairments, did not sort of meet the higher classifications. In Nepal, there was an issue around the criteria being very broad, so they weren't necessarily excluding people with certain impairments on their own, but they were sort of so broad, and there was very little guidance for assessors on how to implement the criteria, that in the end, we did see an over-reliance on medical documentation. So people frequently being asked to provide medical documentation when that was not part of the official guidelines. On the next slide. Attitudes around disability could also dissuade people from applying or influence the outcomes. So in Vietnam, since it was conducted, the application was conducted locally, program officials were frequently involved in either encouraging people to apply or dissuading people to apply. And so their opinions on what qualifies as a disability could very much influence who decided to apply and who did not. And attitudes around aging and disability were particularly at play here. And then the final factor that influenced access is on the next slide. And that is awareness and the perceived utility of programs. So many people were not aware of the benefits or their eligibility for them. And particularly people that didn't think that they were going to be eligible for the most severe categorization and the benefits that came with those. Some of the benefits in the lower categories were perceived to be less useful, and so not worth the effort to apply. And some of these perceptions were valid. I think a key issue concerned the availability and quality of the linked services. So for example, With transportation discounts, they were useful if there was available and accessible transportation, but that is certainly not true for every area of Nepal. Okay, next slide. So the final section, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the adequacy of social protections, whether participation in social protection was enough to ensure people with disabilities were protected from poverty and were able to be more included in areas such as work, education, and accessing healthcare. So on the next slide, I'll share some of those findings. So looking at the responses from recipients, primarily of the disability allowance in both countries, the reported impact was relatively modest. So people reported that it was useful in helping, but not ensuring that their households were able to meet basic food needs. And there was some positive impacts in improving the ability of recipients to get medical care. And interestingly, in Nepal, people reported that receipt of this benefit had improved their relationship with other family members. On the next slide. The key challenge, though, is that when we looked at levels of poverty amongst recipients of these programs, we still found that people with disabilities were very likely to be living in poverty, faced insecurity, and faced barriers to developing stronger livelihoods. So, for example, in Nepal, even amongst recipients, about 40% were still living underneath the international poverty line of $2 per person per day, and were excluded from work and education. And people with disabilities fared worse on pretty much every indicator of socioeconomic circumstances compared to people without disabilities. And between recipients and non-recipients with disabilities, there were generally very few tangible difference on these indicators. The one notable exception we found, though, was in Vietnam. Recipients' healthcare spending was much lower. So they spent about 2/3 less on health expenses compared to people with disabilities who were not receiving social protection. Next slide. So some of the key challenges for adequacy of the program was that the amount that was received in the cash transfers is it's modest. So it's unlikely on its own to be able to meet the living costs or additional needs of people with disabilities. So example, if we look at the disability allowance in Vietnam, people get about $20 a month. But when we measure the extra costs of disability, those are much more higher. So at $94, the allowance covers less than a quarter of extra costs. And also some of the context of the benefits are not aligned to best meet the needs of people with disabilities. So for example, neither health insurance or in Vietnam or the discounts in Nepal fully covered assistive devices or the range of different rehabilitation services that people with disabilities would need. And in Nepal, there was also reports of poor compliance among service providers in honoring benefits. So people would go to use their health discounts or their transportation discounts and be denied at point of use. And then overall, there's a greater need for access to other services. So social protection is useful, but it should be a component of a wide range of other interventions to ensure full inclusion. Okay, so I'm just going to take a second to summarize on the next slide. Okay, and one more. Okay, so in both countries, there was a strong political will to ensuring that people with disabilities are included in social protection and that social protection meets their needs. We could see this in some of the policy changes that have been going on over the number of years. So both countries have been very active in trying to reform their systems. And they also recognize that the exclusion that people with disabilities face is multidimensional, and so they offer a wide range of different programs that are targeting these different drivers of both poverty and exclusion. And looking at ways to improve access. So there's definitely a need to address the various geographic, financial, and informational barriers that are preventing people with disabilities from accessing programs that they're eligible for. In addition, the disability assessments, while they're moving in the right direction, do need reform so that they do not either intentionally or unintentionally exclude certain people with disabilities. Then to improve impact, we need to look at the content of benefits and finding ways to ensure people with disabilities are taking up the full range of benefits, so not just the cash transfers and for Vietnam health insurance, but how to align some of these other benefits so that they're more attractive and easy to use by people with disabilities. And the services that are linked also need to be improved. And then just as a final point, increasing the participation of people with disabilities throughout all stages of the design, delivery, and monitoring of social protection is important. Both countries are working on that, but greater participation is needed. And thank you, that's my presentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Let me just connect myself. 2 seconds. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Morgan. I hope you can see me and hear me now for presenting some of the examples of the research in Vietnam and Nepal, and talking about some of the entitlements, the accesses of the difference in access of the different social protection schemes that you presented and you researched, and also some of the different characterizations of these schemes in terms of the inclusion of persons with disabilities. I think now we have had a good panel and presentations in terms of the case studies and some of the research that both Development Pathways and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Diseases has done. And I think we can now open the floor for some of the questions that we've had from the audience. We've had a quite active sort of questions from our audience. So let me pose some of these questions, and maybe we can, both of you can connect in terms of when we answer some of these questions. Maybe Stephen, you also connect. And we've got a very first question. I'm going to ask them in order, just because to respect the order in which we received some of these questions. So one of the first questions is by Paul, and Paul is asking, talking about support benefits for persons with disability, what are feasible strategies besides benefit schemes, ranging from accommodation, reintegration, and coping mechanisms? And how can social protection systems render people with disabilities economically productive? So that's one of the first questions that we have. Let me just pose 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll go to the panelists so that they can answer in accordance to the questions. And then we have Claire, who asked a question on, did any of the research look at the causes of disability or just functional limitation? So that's the second question we've got there. And then we have a question from Rasmus that says, based on your research, what are the recommendations for establishing accessible disability assessment processes in the context, for example, like Nepal, where you have very limited resources? So those are some of the 3 first questions that I'd like to pose to the panelists. Maybe we can start with Morgan first, so that we don't have audio issues, and then we'll go to Stephen to answer some of these questions, and then we'll have another round of questions if we've got time for that.
Great. Okay, so I will start first with the question about recommendations for the disability assessment, particularly in low resource settings. So I think the move towards a functioning based system is certainly something that is recommended, since that does greatly improve the capacity of states to conduct assessments when medical criteria is used, which is what I understand most countries do tend to use. Medical criteria for assessments in Vietnam and Nepal were more outliers. they tend to be very urban-based, requiring people to travel, and also there's just a low availability of some of these resources in different settings within a country. So I think moving towards a functioning-based system, but then also coupling that with training of assessors, so in-depth regular training about how to use whichever functioning-based assessment criteria is implemented. I think that's sort of the key focus for improving the assessment criteria. Then looking at the other question about some of the causes of disability explored. So we do have data on that hasn't been analyzed yet, since it was sort of more of a secondary outcome of this particular research, but it would be interesting to know. And then looking at sort of schemes besides social protection, I think it is important to note that social protection is one intervention, and that it should really be part of a larger policy in any country of full inclusion across all sectors of society. So we saw in the research in both Vietnam and Nepal that social protection could, for example, remove some of the financial barriers to access, but if schools were not set up to provide learning for children with disabilities, or transportation was inaccessible, then the benefits of social protection are not as useful. Stephen, do you want to add anything to either of those questions?
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. Yeah, I'd add something. I think in terms of the other services, I mean, it's a critically important area. You know, I don't think we want to be saying just giving people income security from, you know, from social protection systems is sufficient, but it's absolutely essential to do that. But there's a range of other services that need to be put in place, and the access. One thing that we often forget about, and it's, you know, I've got a disabled child myself, is the importance of having an effective social work system in place in countries to be able to support families, particularly, you know, that are struggling. And many countries have very, very weak social work systems, and really it's not an area that's much talked about in international development. But I think another area that came up in our research, which is, you know, it's linked to the services, is actually the fact that in many countries there's a tendency to develop organizations, parastatal or government organizations that are responsible for persons with disability, that tend to be located within the weakest ministry of government, say Ministry of Social Welfare, and then the weakest place, and then hardly are given any resources, and they're then meant to take on responsibility for all areas of services for persons with disability, even health or assistive devices, etc., for access to livelihoods programs, rather than ensuring that these services should be mainstreamed right across all ministries and all areas of support. And one of the recommendations we were making on support is really that rather than having these very small underfunded organizations, really what countries should be looking at is placing responsibility for disability at a very, very high level within government, at cabinet level, or within the presidents, that can ensure and monitor ensure that all ministries are beginning to mainstream support to persons with disability on an equal basis and address the specific needs that they have. I think in terms of people economically productive, I think you know, one of the key issues I was saying in the talk is that we need to see the actual reality of giving people some kind of disability benefit, which is really focused on enabling people to overcome these additional costs that they face so that they can get into work on an equal basis. It's about essentially equal opportunities of persons with disability with the rest of the population, because they experience a many disadvantage with these higher costs, which are makes it very difficult just to get into a job. If you can't actually, you know, afford the bus fare, you're not going to get a job. So this needs to be addressed, as well as enabling people with disabilities to access and monitor on an equal basis. You can see around the world systems where you give quotas for persons with disability, but often they don't work, or it's only those with certain privileges get in, and it really needs to be addressed at a much higher level. I think on the question of causes, we didn't look at that in our research. It was all about accessibility to social protection rather than the causes of that, and the data sets that we would just use national data sets as well as the qualitative research that we were doing with key stakeholders in countries didn't really lend itself to looking at the causes, but I think it would be interesting to highlight. And I think just one question on the sort of accessible assessment. I mean, there are many countries doing many different types of assessments. Many of the assessments themselves are actually creating very, very significant barriers for people because it's very difficult to get through them. Often the people making the assessments, even on medical assessments, aren't trained. In South Africa, we found many cases of medical assessments that were, even though it's a relatively well-funded one, you would think of assessments that were undertaken in less than 3 minutes, where you couldn't do a proper disability assessment, which then meant that many people with disabilities that weren't so visible were then excluded from getting support. And I think the key conclusion is really there's a lot of debate about the right type of assessment mechanism. The key thing is countries need to invest significantly in this to make them work well for their country. Even a medical assessment, if it's in place, if it's working well and supported, it is really important to, you know, the important is to invest and do it well and ensure it doesn't create the barriers themselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for that. Morgan, do you have any more responses to that first round of questions, or can I go ahead with the second round of questions?
I'm all set if you want to go ahead.
Okay, so we've got some more interesting, we've got actually quite a lot of questions, so I have to choose them, so because we don't have that much time. There's another question that Sergey is asking for Morgan, and he's asking specifically what are the extra costs in this research that you're referring to. We also have an interesting questions by some interesting question from Nicholas. So there's one that says, are any tools available that provide guidance drawn from experience in other countries on how to assess and classify degrees of severity of disability? This would presumably help those countries that want to introduce disability-specific or disability-relevant schemes. And then let me just ask one more question. There's one specific question. Let me find it. I'm trying to identify it here. So we've got, just so that you're aware, we've got an audience, from different countries. So they're talking from France, from here in the UK, from Nepal. So we've got a global group of participants here too. There's one question here from Nepal. Let's say I can't see that. Let's just go with those two questions, and then we'll ask another one or two questions if we've got time. So maybe we can start with Stephen this time around, and then go to Morgan. I'll mute myself.
Thanks. I think there was really the second question that was more addressed on the sort of guidance on disability assessments. I mean, I think this is one of the challenges. There's a whole international debate and discussions going on about how best to do disability assessments and people trying to come up with guidance. So there's bits of work that have been done. There's work that has been led by the WHO, but I don't think anybody's yet come up with a definitive tool. There are, you know, tools that you can find for medical assessments. Some of them not very good, which come up with, you know, questions like somebody's got 43% disability or 62% disability, and very detailed tables about how to assess that, which don't actually then look at issues around the interaction of that person with the environment. And I think it's an area that has been invested in much more, but it's an area that does require more work and ways of developing systems that are much easier to implement in low and middle income countries at lower cost, which are effective in identifying disability, particularly amongst the people with more invisible disabilities. So I'll leave that there.
Well, I'll start off with answering the question about extra costs. So For this study, we weren't able to say specifically what the source of the extra costs were. So the method we did for that, it's one that's outlined. There's an article, it's Zaidi et al., which is sort of one standard method for calculating extra costs. And basically what that's doing is it's looking at something like assets, which are an indicator of standard of living. And so comparing standard of living for different incomes between people with and without disabilities, and looking at sort of the gap between standard of living based on a given level of income. Although I can't say exactly what the extra costs are, but healthcare spending is definitely a large proportion of them. So we did look at healthcare expenditures in both countries, and for people with disabilities, their households spent significantly more on healthcare, so about 2 to 3 times more than households without members with disabilities. So that's certainly a large source of extra costs. And then I would just mirror what Stephen has said on sort of the guidance for classifying severity of disability. It's difficult, I think it's inherently quite subjective, and capturing sort of both the impact of the environment and the access to assistive devices and availabilities of individual supports is something that is difficult. It's a global challenge, and I don't believe there at the moment is clear, universally agreed upon guidance for that.
Very much, both of you. We've got more questions. There's some interesting questions on PMTs that I'd like to read out for the presenters. One of the participants, Mandipa, is asking if you can kindly explain the proxy means test with regards to Malawi that show the correlation between exclusion and inclusion errors, and how best to use this information presented in the diagram to provide solutions in the future in terms of better helping the people with persons with disabilities. That's one question with regards to the PMTs. And there's another one here related also to the PMTs. It says, and it's a question specifically to Stephen, it says, how do we improve, it's by you, and he's asking, how do we improve the targeting approach after the fall of the PMTs? Will the community-based targeting increase the targeting? So those are 2 questions on PMTs. How after they fail, I suppose, after they fail.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. So yeah, so we gave an example of Malawi, which was showing the design errors of the Malawi proxy means test. Now, of course, once countries are just implementing programs for the very poor, we know that leads to very high levels of exclusion, and it's probably, if you really want an inclusive system, that's exactly the wrong approach. So you're already in a problematic area once you're implementing these schemes, because you do have very high levels of exclusion, both of people with disabilities and people without disabilities. What we were trying to show in our research is that you can actually, if you are using a proxy means test, improve it in different ways to make it more disability inclusive. And it is interesting when you look across the proxy means tests that are used around the world, none of them really take into account disability in any way, apart from, I think, in Pakistan, where if you do have a classification as and I think in Palestine, if you have an official classification, which is very difficult to get as a person with disability, that will be taken into account in the scoring system. No way guarantees you access, and most people would find it very difficult to get that disability classification. So what we were trying to do was to look at was to use the proxy means test was to integrate questions from the Washington group set of questions, integrate them into a household survey, and develop a proxy means test that would take into account not just the conventional proxies for a proxy means test, but also take into account the answers from the Washington group set of questions as some indicator of disabilities, so that you could begin to identify people in that way, including through the survey that you would do, and then to modify the formula to ensure through analysis you could do that you would include many more people with disabilities in that. And we found a couple of ways in which that could be done. but it's essential then that countries invest in household surveys, including the Washington Group set of questions as a limited way, and then including that in the surveys so that you can identify those households that tend to have people with high levels of disability, and then ensure that and the additional costs that they face are taken into account in the PMT formula. And the slide that I showed on the right showed that you could make a very, very significant difference with that. On the other question on the targeting approach, what happens when PMTs fail? Well, I think we know that PMTs fail. We've got examples of very, very high errors. We just put out a blog recently showing in Kyrgyzstan that's trying to get rid of the PMT because it's almost random selection. Rural Tanzania, there's a recent report by the World Bank showing almost random selection of the PMT in many countries, and that they are already failing. I think it's the key thing is to, you can try and improve, I think, community-based selection. In some experiences, whether you're combining community-based targeting with proxy means tests, it's not leading to any better results. The Tanzania example is that it's almost random selection. Northern Kenya, on the Hunger Safety Net program, they found random selection using both methods. So that's not really going to help. Once you're in that, you're going to have to accept that there are going to be very, very high errors. Anyway, I think this is one of our points, is that people need to start working at a much higher level of policy and changing the whole approach to how social protection is introduced, to make it much more inclusive, much more on the basis of citizenship, so that people can begin to access schemes that are given on a more inclusive or universal basis, which requires much more investment. But these are, in the end, much more popular schemes that governments can get behind. I mean, I think it's great a country like Kenya just about to make its first payments, I think, next month on a universal old age pension, which will have significant benefit for people with disabilities. Taking that kind of approach and then extending it to people of working age and children would be really, really important. It's about a country committing to being really inclusive and realizing they have to invest much more in social protection.
Thank you, Stephen. Morgan, do you want to add anything on the PMTs, or do you want to go for the next round? Some specific questions too for you.
I think Stephen answered them perfectly. So if there's additional questions, then I'm happy to.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the very last round of questions. We've got one question specifically for you, Morgan. It's actually from Nepal, and the person asking the question has come across issues around corruption in terms of the delivery of programs, I mean, services and programs for persons with disability. And so he is asking if there's anything in your research that you came across with that in the case of Nepal. And then there's one question, I suppose, for the first presentation for Stephen. It is by Paul. I don't know which country it's from, but anyways, Paul is asking, the concept of disability-sensitive programs was highlighted. However, it appears that disability-sensitive programs are not very effective because of unwillingness or inability to work. My question, Paul's question, is can we distinguish between disability-sensitive and disability-responsive programs, and how can we move from disability-sensitive to disability-responsive programs? So I think it's a question addressed to you, Stephen, but maybe both of you have some answers. Maybe we can start with you, Morgan.
Sure. So I'll take a question about corruption for Nepal. So we did find very few people without disabilities were getting the disability allowance. So there doesn't seem to be sort of corruption on that side, or I mean, for other reasons. We did find that there were some issues in that sometimes people were not getting benefits, and that could, I mean, it's possible that there's an element of corruption, or it could just be challenges in delivery methods or poor understanding. So one example of that would be for some of the scholarships in Nepal. Those are, some of them go to the school directly if the child boards there, or if the child does not board, they're supposed to go to the family. But there was quite a lot of issues in terms of, since the amounts are distributed from the schools, the money not necessarily getting to the parents, whether that's corruption or whether that's a misunderstanding, I couldn't say for certain, but there were some issues in that. And then, Stephen, do you want to take the second question?
Yeah, just to mention that the question from Paul is from Switzerland.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I wasn't saying is that disability-specific programs are not working. I think they're essential and are working. What I think is the strange thing in the design is how many countries design schemes that explicitly discourage people with disability from working, which is almost, you know, undermining the whole basis. Most people with disabilities of working age are able to work. We should be doing whatever we can to help people get into work, not putting up these disincentives to not work by banning you from a scheme, from a scheme if you don't work. And I think there are countries, you know, that are addressing this by ensuring that people can access a benefit at working age that helps them overcome these additional costs and help them get into work. And I think that's what we really need to be doing. I think that's where it becomes, in a sense, I like the term sort of disability responsive. It is much more responsive to the needs and requirements of persons with disability. Of course, these costs vary between different people, and the more that you could address that and tailor that, as you do in certain high income countries in terms of the amount of compensation or support that people get, that's really important. But much more needs to be done than just giving people the benefit. I mean, I think it is interesting looking at the examples of Nepal. I don't know how well it works in terms of free transportation, subsidized transportation, etc. Can also help people. It doesn't have to be just about giving the cash, but a broader set of support, and also ensuring absence of, you know, eliminating discrimination in the labor market, which I think is one of the biggest barriers that people face. So it all needs to be coming together, but what we need to get away from is this creating disincentives to work by saying you can only get a scheme if you don't work, and that's a very bad design.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that. I think we've finalized our time, our allotted time for this webinar, so I think we will need to close. We've had very interesting questions and presentations. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. I have been told that the presentations and also the audio and video of this presentation will be uploaded on the socialprotection.org platform after this webinar. I'm not sure exactly when. So anybody who wasn't able to join might be able to listen to it, to hear it afterwards. Thank you very much on behalf of the Morgon Pathways and also our collaboration with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you very much, everybody, and until next time.